Good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 68th in the series where we're looking at stories of holidays. My name's Lorna Steele, I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And for those of you who don't know, the Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Skye and Lochalish Archive Centre in Portree, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. The 4 of them make up the Highland Archive Service, where we look after historic documents going back to the 1200s right up to the present day that tell the story of the Highlands of Scotland. This series is brought to you by High Life Island at no cost to the viewer. High Life Island is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of films. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. It enables us to continue collecting the documents, sharing them, interpreting them and giving people access to them. So if you're able to donate, there's a link to be able to do so in the film, and we're really grateful for those of you who are able to do that. So this week we're carrying on the theme of sport and leisure by looking at documents in our collections relating to holidays. As I mentioned last week, this one is pre-recorded because I am on holiday, and I know some of you had been concerned earlier in the year about me never getting a holiday, so I'm on holiday. Of course, holidays this year and last year have been very different from what they have been in most of our lifetimes. Constantly in the press, there's so much talk about flights, about accessing other countries, and so on. But of course, for much of our history, holidays meant something very different to the image that word tends to conjure up today, and it's a privilege of travel and experience that we've become used to very quickly. In the past, most people wouldn't have had much time off work. If they did have time off, largely it would be spent near to home, because travel was costly and time-consuming and difficult, and that meant that often there were only certain sectors of society who were able to travel for leisure. And many of the items that we hold in our collections relating to other countries tend to be to do with industry or military service, time spent in the Caribbean, time spent in the East India Company, things like that, rather than travelling for relaxation. And so a lot of what I will talk about today and what I'll touch on will fall into the category of people, those who could afford to go on holiday. And in our collections we hold letters and postcards and diaries and photographs and sketches and all sorts of things that convey that experience of people travelling for leisure. And I'm going to start by looking at some holidays taken in the Highlands, and then look at some holidays taken elsewhere in the UK, and then further afield. I'm going to start with Malcolm Blaine. Anyone who has heard me over the past year and a half will have heard me speak of Malcolm Blaine, and so I'm not going to go into detail about Malcolm's life story on here, but if you're interested in finding out, please do go onto YouTube and have a look for the Malcolm Blaine episode that I did some time ago, and I'm sure if anyone has seen that, they will back me up in saying that it's an interesting story. So I'm not going to go into Malcolm's whole story, but I'm just going to say we hold 7 of Malcolm's diaries from the years 1901 to 1905, when he was aged around 7 to 11. He lived in the south of England, but he travelled to Nairn each year for his holidays, something that he absolutely loved. He had a very strong attachment to coming up to the Highlands on his holidays, and his diaries are full of details of the holiday events that he undertook with his family, the trips that he took, particularly his train journeys from the south of England to the Highlands and around while he was here. He was very passionately fond of trains, and so lots of illustrations of the journey. And while in the Highlands, he would go on lots of adventures and go to lots of places around the Highlands, either on foot or on bike, from Nairn or by boat. And I wanted to read to you an extract or two that talks about some of his excursions and experiences while he was here. He often talks about expeditions, going on expeditions and having a trip that he's wanted to do for a long time, and they finally have the adventure. So I wanted to read a couple of those to you. 25th of September 1903. He would be about 10 years old at this point, 10 or 11. Away to see the Channel Squadron. We set out for Nairn Harbour at 11 a.m. to catch the special boat starting at midday. We were the last to be admitted on board, and we were numbers 138, 139 and 140. The water was like a duck pond, and a warm, slight misty breeze blew over it. We passed 2 men of war outside the firth. One followed us into the firth to Invergordon. You see 2 things that you see well at Nairn, the 2 rocks called the Suitors' Rocks. I don't know the history of them, but they look very grand, red sandstone. As we pass round the corner, we come in front of Cromarty. We pass the second corner and are in sight of the men of war anchored outside Invergordon, and these are the names of them. HMS: Majestic, Doris, Magnificent, Prince George, Hogue, Sutley, Hamnable, Jupiter, and 2 others. We got on board HMS Magnificent and got a sailor to take us around. He first took us to a gun and carefully explained how it works and the ins and outs of it. We went downstairs, we passed over the ammunition rooms, by some of the engine rooms. It was a long time, up and down everywhere on those thin iron ladders, generally perpendicular without any railing of any description. Our own vessel came back at 3:30 and we came home to Nairn. I love that at 10 years old he's using the word perpendicular and lamenting the lack of railings. 1904, August 1904, he's back in Nairn on his holidays, and he says this time, "It was the day before we went to Edinburgh. I went to lunch with the Thorburns, and after lunch, I, Keith Thorburn and Gilbert Hainsworth all bicycled about 3 miles along the road by the quarries as far as a farm on the road to Forres. Here we left our bicycles and took our tea with us, escorted by a farm boy to the shore. We all took our shoes and stockings and hung them around our necks, and plodded for well over an hour across sands, straight seaward, all among the quicksand, carrying our tea between us, until we came to a deep channel, unfordable, and immediately the other side of it was the long narrow island, the Bar. At last we came to a place that was fordable, and we crossed. Oh, how bitterly cold it was. Cold water, the strongest northeast wind. Oh, how painful it was to cross the long stone-clad beach of the Bar. We threw ourselves down to eat. We had no time to explore the island, as the tide was coming in and the channel was growing deeper, so back we went. Another long, perilous journey. It was already sunset before we arrived at the mainland, numbed as we were. There was no time for the bonfire we had proposed, but we all on our way back to the farm played games, sprawling in the great heather bushes till we got a spark of warmth. When I arrived home I had punctured my tyre and lost a stocking, and so ended the long wished-for expedition to the Bar, which had been proposed for over a year and a half. I absolutely love that. I just think it's so, conjures up so much excitement, and if you have similar memories to that, please do share them, because that excitement of the expedition and how little often it takes for a child to have a great holiday. He gets soaking wet, freezing cold, and he's had a marvellous time. Malcolm, while he was here, would often also accompany his parents on trips further afield. So he talks about going to Crathis Castle, to Urquhart Castle, to Inverness, and also on longer trips down the length of the Caledonian Canal. There's one extract in his diary where he talks about travelling down the Caledonian Canal and an Irishman getting on the boat, and it's particularly good spelling. It's IRRSHE, Irish, MUN. An Irishman getting on and playing a flute while dressed in traditional dress, and how exciting Malcolm finds it, and how much money the man is given for dancing a jig, and Malcolm records this with great delight in his diaries. On one occasion, Malcolm and his father were staying in Oban, and they set out to go on a trip to Staffa and Iona, but they were told that the boat wouldn't be able to stop at Staffa, so they changed their plans and instead went on a round trip to Ballachulish, Glencoe and Glenetiv. And Malcolm's diary includes, of course, a map and illustration of the journey from Oban to Ballachulish by boat, and then through Glencoe and Glenetiv by stagecoach. And they stopped at the King's house, and he describes it pouring with rain, torrential rain. He says he's never seen any rain like it in all his 10 or 11 years. And then ticking off all the transport types, so they already had boat and stagecoach. They then returned on the steamer Ossian from Lochetiv Head to Achnacloich, and then by train to Oban. And so you get a real sense of them exploring while they're here, but of course it comes with an awareness that that was a privileged situation to be in, and that they had the resource to be able to do that. Another example in our collections that talks of someone touring and visiting various sites on holiday comes from our Lochaber Archive Centre collections. And this is D165, deposited collection, Colonel Henry Platt's notes on an 1895 yachting trip. The pages open with a description of his time in Wales. So he talks about Carnarvon Castle, Bangor, Llandudno, and the astonishing engineering of the Menai Bridge and the Britannia Bridge, which were Telford and Stevenson bridges respectively. And he talks about his appreciation of this amazing engineering and beauty. And then from Wales, Colonel Platt travelled on, took the yacht to the Isle of Man to attend the yachting regatta at Douglas and Ramsey before going on to head north into Scotland. And I wanted to read an extract to you that explains a little bit about their journey and a little bit about, if any of you have yachted before, I'm sure this is something that hasn't really changed, these concerns. So he says, on Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. we left Kingairloch and anchored in Oban Bay. At 8:20 a.m. where we took in coal and water, and where we remained until Wednesday night at 6 p.m. when we left for the north. Sailing through the Sound of Mull, round Ardnamurchan Point, through the Sound of Sleat, pressing into the Minch at about 2 a.m. on Thursday. The weather up to that time had been fine, but about 5 a.m. the wind freshened, and the sea rising, the yacht commenced to jump about. Too much for the owner's wife, so we put back and ran into Ullapool, where the owner's wife and youngest daughter left us and coached it 34 miles to get the train for Thurso, being afraid to risk the passage around the Cape of Good Hope. And you may, the Cape of Good Hope, around Cape Wroth. You may remember we've spoken a little bit about Cape Wroth in the past and about what a dangerous stretch of water it was, and it seems to have been a very good decision for the owner and her owner's wife and daughter to get off, because the next few pages detail rounding Cape Wroth and the windows and doors having to be firmly jarred shut and the boat diving into the water and the spray covering the deck. And they end up taking a brief respite in Loch Eriboll before continuing their journey on to Thurso and then north to Norway. So an extraordinary journey. Also in Lochaber, in the extensive McCall collection, are the holiday memories of a lady called Beth Robertson. It's a 5-volume manuscript entitled I Took the High Road, and there's 8 pages that sit alongside it that tell the story of a holiday taken in London in 1927. I really wish I had time to read you the whole 8 pages, because it is A, beautifully written, but B, aspects of it are completely unchanged even though it's been 100 years. If there's anyone watching in London, please confirm this, but certainly London is a place I've spent a lot of time in. That's where my parents come from, and there are aspects of this that are absolutely correct today. These 8 pages include beautifully detailed accounts of her excitement at visiting the Tower of London, seeing the Crown Jewels and the Beefeaters, her emotion at visiting Westminster Abbey, standing in Poets' Corner and feeling a connection to Chaucer and Dickens and so many writers who are buried or commemorated there. Another thing that's particularly touching is her note that, powerful though it was for her to stand amongst the memorials to these writers, it paled in comparison with standing at the tomb of the unknown warrior, and how that made her feel with the light slanting in through the windows and falling near the tomb, and how that made her feel. She also talks about learning the unusual street names, so Threadneedle Street, Birdcage Walk, Fox Under the Hill, Hanging Sword Alley. She talks about in great delight about that, and you'll know that I love words and I love names, so it's a beautifully written document. Okay, so I wanted to read you 2 extracts from this, and you'll see some things that have not changed at all if you have spent any time at all in London. After freshening up and having tea here this afternoon, we took one of the big double-decker omnibuses into the city proper, choosing the top for better sightseeing along the way. A friendly conductor made himself our guide and pointed out to us Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, Buckingham and St James's Palaces, Marlborough House, which in late years has replaced St James as the home of the Prince of Wales, and other places and things of interest as we rode along. The parks and gardens were full of people, walking, strolling, sitting, and along a beautiful path or track just inside the high iron fence bordering Hyde Park, we caught glimpses of handsome horses carrying well-dressed riders. This is the famed Rotten Row, which we learned is simply a corruption of the old name Route du Roi, in French, the Route of the King. It was fun to ride up on that high bus stop, almost as fun as bowling along the boulevards of Paris had been in the swift little taxi, and it seemed wonderful to me to be seeing all these places that I had read about and heard about all my life. We got off the bus at Hotel Cecil and visited Legion headquarters there, afterwards returning to the bureau, as one learns an office is called here, to engage our rooms for tomorrow and Tuesday. We then walked westward down the Strand to Trafalgar Square and stood looking up at Nelson's monument silhouetted there against the setting sun, and at the hundreds of pigeons that fluttered around Landseer's noble lions at the base. An old man and a small boy were scattering crumbs to the birds, and a young girl on a park bench near us was making a sketch in her notebook. In all and about this famous square were things to interest us. On the north, the National Gallery; to the south, Charing Cross. Long ago, when King Edward I was making the sad journey to Westminster Abbey with the remains of his beloved Queen Eleanor, he erected a cross to her memory at each stage where the bier rested. This then is how Charing Cross got its name, for one of the crosses was erected on this site. So that image of Trafalgar Square with all the pigeons. And then this one. Outside, we walked back towards our waiting bus through ancient flagstoned courtyards, walled in by moss-covered walls of stone beside the moat. Here at regular intervals stood the Coldstream Guardsmen in their little sentry boxes, motionless as statues, arms stiffly by their sides and their noses pink with the autumn chill. They were all fine-looking young fellows, straight and tall and smartly rigged in jackets of scarlet, blue trousers with scarlet stripe, and towering chin-strap busbies of black bearskin. A trio of ardent tourists walking just ahead of us in the Tower grounds stopped to take a snap of one of the guardsmen, discussing him under his nose as if he was part of the landscape, and although he seemed no more conscious of them than the stone image he indeed resembled, he met our amused eyes with him a moment later as we passed, with the faintest flicker of a smile, and then astonishingly he dropped one eyelid in an unmistakable wink. I love that, and again, I'm sure if any of you have been there, you will have seen that the people thronging round the guards as they stand outside Buckingham Palace and other sites, and it is almost like people don't think they're real people. We also hold items in our collections that talk about Highlanders going on holidays further afield, and I'll come back to that after I've given you a brief reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events, but if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. I had thought next to tell you about a fantastic descriptive letter in our collections that was written in 1817 and describes in the most vivid detail a trip to Florence. But as I started writing my notes, I thought, I'm sure I've shared this with you before, and then I looked back and sure enough I have already, so I'm going to miss that one out. And instead I'm going to come to some other documents that talk about Highlanders going to different locations. The first is a diary kept by Edward and Edith Fraser Tytler during their holiday to Egypt in 1881-82. And this is part of the Fraser Tytler collection, which I'm sure you will remember me talking about a lot. It is my absolute favourite collection, and I know I say it a lot, but it is my favourite collection. And I spoke a little bit during that week about Edward Grant Fraser Tytler and his wife Edith Selwyn. Edward was instrumental in setting up the Lovat Scouts at the turn of the century, and he himself fought in South Africa during the Boer Wars, as did other family members in 1900 and 1901. And we've got extensive correspondence about that, really vivid letters describing his time and experience in combat in South Africa. But as we're looking at holidays, I'm going to come back 20 years before the Boer Wars to 1881-82, when Edward was in his 20s and on holiday in Egypt with his wife Edith, several years before their children were born. So this extract here, so as I say 1881-82, he describes June the 10th. No, he doesn't. I'm sorry, January the 10th. Wind still south, towed up to the island of Rhoda a short way. On the afternoon we sent for donkeys and rode across the island and the new donkeys, and we crossed the narrow stream on boats to the mainland, and we rode through Old Cairo. We saw a very old Coptic church built on the spot where Joseph and the Virgin Mary rested during their flight to Egypt. There was some very fine inlaid work and some very old pictures in the church. Another extract from January the 12th in Memphis says, January the 12th, Thursday, wind due south, so we settled to take lunch and see Memphis and Saqqara. Started at 11 a.m, well equipped. We passed through the palm woods and saw the wonderful mounds of mud among the trees that are now all that is left of the once great Memphis, or Noph, of the Bible. Joseph is said to have lived here, it being the ancient city of the Pharaohs. It was destroyed by the Saracens in the 7th century, and the desert is gradually encroaching on this bank of the river, and has fulfilled the prophecy that Noph shall be waste without an inhabitant. We saw some old statues, half broken, which Mariette Bey had dug out, and the great statue of Ramesses the Great, who lies upon his face. It's really interesting to read these diaries of these experiences in Egypt. Another one describes going to the Valley of the Kings and talks about how the long journey it took them, and the feeling that of the hills closing in as they got down and down into the valley. You'll know, some of you will know that I've been to Egypt. It was a place that I was, one of the only places in the world I was absolutely desperate to visit, and I'm so grateful that I've been there, and again I'm aware of what a privilege that is, and you'll know because we talk about this bull from time to time. If you're new, we talk about this bull from time to time, which is an alabaster bull that I got when I was in Egypt, and it's the most astonishing country to visit. And these diaries really kind of conjure that up, that feeling of otherness and how very different it was from the rest of their world. And they talk about visiting the Valley of the Kings, this feeling of the valley closing down on them, and the fact that they talk about the gaping holes for the tomb openings in the Valley of the Kings. They describe the tombs that they go into, but say that the experience was lessened for them by the vast mob of Cookites. Now I assume that to mean Thomas Cook travellers, because Cook was doing holidays to Egypt by this point. And so they say that the experience of being in the Valley of the Kings was somewhat lessened by all the tourists thronging about them. Fascinating to think that was, a good 50 years really before Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. And so they're in that place not knowing how much more is lying under their feet, which I find a really exciting thing to think. The next extract I wanted to share with you comes from Edward and Edith's son Neil Fraser Tytler, who was born in 1889. And Neil had a very eventful life. He served, as so many of his generation did, in World War I in the Royal Field Artillery. And we have his diaries for that time in the First World War. But unlike them, unlike other young men, he also then went on to attend the Supreme War Council at Versailles after the war. But as we did with his father Edward, for this episode we're going to bypass the years of his life that were affected by conflict overseas and look at his travels in the 1920s. So Neil, with his wife Christian, travelled in South America. He visited Peru, Chile, Argentina and other places. And I wanted to read a little bit of a letter he sent home to his sister Hester. We have a huge collection of letters between these members of this family. And this is a letter sent back to Hester by Neil. The second stairway of hills is wonderful. Vivid colours like one imagines the Grand Canyon of the Colorado must be like. Terrific gorges around the edge of which the train tears, with the edge of the coach hanging over eternity. At intervals, glimpses of intense cultivation along the Chile, at first in a 20-yard wide step on one side, and then gradually getting wider until within 10 miles of Arequipa there are several miles across the valley. In many ways this journey is incredibly interesting, and he says it's more interesting than another part which is supposed to be interesting, which is a train line climbing a gorge. He says that's mainly just mechanical gymnastics in an endless gorge. But this experience of taking a train through another country and looking at the scenery is what he's really enjoying. And there's another extract where he talks about the Incan terraces, seeing the terraces that are constructed into the side of the hill, and being aware of the long history of the Incan civilization. Now, you may have noticed that I'm moving further and further away from the Highlands. So it started in Nairn and then the Caledonian Canal, and then on the yachting expedition, then in London, and then in Egypt, moving further and further away. And so for the final extract, I'm going to go as far as New Zealand by looking at the journals of Constance Charlotte Astley, which are held in the Lochaber Archive Centre as part of the West Highland Museum collection. Constance Astley was a member of the Astley-Nicholson family, who were the proprietors of the Arasaig estate. And she is, which is in Lochaber, for those who don't know, she was a prolific letter writer and diarist. She corresponded with Robert Browning, she corresponded with Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, and she kept journals throughout her life as well, and we hold them from the 1870s through to 1903. You've heard me, if you have heard me at all, you've heard me sing the praises of diaries and journals before, and these are particularly fascinating ones. As well as recording her doings, they include press cuttings on local events, poems, paintings, lists of expenditures on dances, music, wine, all sorts of things that give an insight into her life. But her diaries also include notes on travels. So, for instance, there's a voyage to St Kilda, a tour in Skye, 10 days in Normandy, a trip to the Black Forest, Dresden and Vienna, a trip to the Scilly Isles. So her diaries often contain references to holiday. But of particular interest here that I'm going to round off with are the two journals and the collection of loose papers entitled Journal Around the World, Volume 1 and Volume 2. This was a trip to New Zealand that she took with her close friend Margaret Shane. There are lovely extracts from this. I could have picked any number of lovely extracts from these diaries. Talk about the journey there, which of course took weeks and weeks. She visits Canada, and she talks about travelling from Banff to Winnipeg on part of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Describes it as so queer to go to bed among the mountains and wake up in the prairies. And she describes the scenery and the sights from the train, flowers, horses, cattle, local people, and so on. But the bulk of the diaries relate to her time spent in New Zealand, and they contain beautiful descriptions of many of the places that we have that we would know today. And if you've heard me speak before, you'll know I have a various connections to New Zealand of my own family going back several generations, but also my partner's family live there now. And Elizabeth, if you're watching, I know I need to email you with my details of my family in New Zealand. But these diaries contain references to places that I have visited, that some of you may have visited, from 100 years ago. So Rotorua, Wellington, Auckland, and so on. Constance describes in lovely detail her interaction with the Maori, because she was involved at home in crafting and carving and creating things. And so she talks about her delight at learning about Maori carving and so on. And I wanted to read this lovely extract that describes her seeing Aoraki Mount Cook both at night time and then again the following morning. So she says, "Afterwards, we just caught the sunset glow on Mount Cook from a mound at the back of the house. It was succeeded by a death-like pallor, the snow looking almost green in contrast to the pinkish tinge in the sky behind. I went a little further and sat on a little hillock, gazing over heaps of moraine rubbish dimly seen in the twilight. At this pale and awful monument, the very type and image of death dominating everything. Then there came the ineffably mysterious change, and it was again luminous, not ruddy, glowing, but as if it were spiritualized and transfigured, and the sky became more transparent and let the stars shine through, and the silence seemed to utter itself in a great sound of water or rushing wind, and then night fell. Sunday, February the 27th, a glorious morning, out before breakfast and climbed to the top of a little moraine mound a few 100 yards from the house, whence I had a lovely view of both Mount Cook and Mount Sefton, which lies to the left and is much nearer. A beautiful white cloud floated across in front of Mount Cook, above which his majestic snow-crowned head shone and sparkled in the morning sun, and just the peaks of the lower serrated ridge showed dark. A few 100 feet only of his base appeared just above the moraine. At my feet was a grassy flat where horses fed and cows with bells whose peaceful tinkling contrasted strangely with the distant thunder of avalanches. And behind the house rose a great moraine mound 300 or 400 feet high, which was once clothed with beautiful bush, but now, alas, is entirely destroyed by fire, to the immeasurable detriment of the landscape, as it is the most prominent object in the foreground. Again, and I know I say this week in, week out, but I do love people who can turn a phrase to something and describe. There's something beautiful about that description of the sky became transparent and let the stars shine through, and the silence seemed to utter itself in a great sound of waters or a rushing wind, and night fell. It's very beautiful. Those diaries are held in our Lochaber Archive Centre, but there are also copies held of them in the National Library of New Zealand. So Elizabeth or anyone else watching in New Zealand who wants to track that down and have a look at them, you can do so. There was also this book that was published in 1997 to mark the centenary of Constance Astley's trip to New Zealand. I wanted to finish by reading her final diary extract as she leaves New Zealand to go to Vancouver. It's particularly beautiful. So she says, "The sun has set and we are looking our last on New Zealand. How fond I have become of it in 4 months. It has only one fault, and that is that it is so far from home, and there are such a terrible number of people in it that I want to see again." And as someone who has a wedding coming up shortly and immediate family in New Zealand, I can sympathise with that feeling. I hope you have enjoyed learning some of the stories in our collections to do with holidays. I hope wherever you are in the world, you're able to get a little bit of a holiday over this summer. And thank you for joining me to learn about these stories. Please do share any memories you have, either of the Highlands or other places on holiday. Please share them. I know I'm not live, but I will definitely see them. Next week, I'll be looking at the story of Sinclair Mackay, Mr. Football, from our collection held in Nucleus and Nuclear and Caithness Archive. So I hope you can join me next week when I will be back live. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. Thank you.